Hello, everybody. It's Michael Hollands once again for Sound of the Movies. Today I have the pleasure to be joined by Mr. Simon Franglen. And on today's episode, we will focus on his great work on Avatar, The Way of Water. It is my pleasure to welcome Simon Franglen.
It's very nice to be here, Michael.
It's great to have you on my show. Thank you very much for taking the time out of your schedule. I really appreciate that, Simon. At first, I would like to go back in time just a little bit to the year 2009 when the first Avatar was released. You also worked on the picture. James Horner was the lead composer on the project. Please talk to me a bit about your involvement on the first Avatar. I know you produced the song I See You. You did some electronic arrangements.
Yeah, so I was, obviously I was asked by James if I wanted to come and have a look at the 5 minutes of the film, and I could see it was very special. And so we created sort of a role for me, which we called electronic music arranger, which was the stuff that wasn't the orchestra. So it was the sound of Jake looking around in the night with the glowing forest. It was the percussion and the rhythmic side of things, the more indigenous side, and the textural parts of the score, I think, is the way that I'd approach it. And that evolved through the film. Obviously, I was doing certain arrangements in the film, and then we sort of just continued. We enjoyed each other's company. We enjoyed working with each other, so that continued through. That relationship continued onwards.
Great. And I would like to briefly talk about your work relationship with James Horner. James sadly passed away, I think, 7 years ago. And you had worked with him on Titanic, on Southpaw, Living in the Age of Airplanes, and also Wolf Totem, and a few other projects. How would you verbalize how much his music meant to you and the collaboration?
Well, I mean, we were obviously very close friends. And after Avatar, we'd done Titanic together, and then I'd gone off and done other things, and it was Avatar. We realized that we actually enjoyed working together, and there was more than just James. There was a whole team that we enjoyed each other's company. We enjoyed working, and there was, I think, the next film we did with Karate Kid, and then there was Spider-Man, Amazing Spider-Man, and so on. And my role evolved to something we ended up calling score producer, which would mean I would sort of oversee the sort of delivery of the score. And that was just, it was really enjoyable. So, we had a great time. And it was a terrible shock when James died. I was producing the score for the park at that time, the Pandora, the World of Avatar. Yeah. And we had a number of other scores that we were going to work on. There was obviously the upcoming Magnificent Seven, but we were also looking at planning for what would be Hacksaw Ridge and the Great Wall, the Yang Jimu film, and so on. And there was a couple of other things, and obviously the Avatar sequels. So when he died, I was already into the production for the park, and Jim and John asked me to continue working and then to take over writing the music for the theme park. And there was 5 hours of music to write for the park, and it had to have that Avatar texture. And from there, we evolved into, the conversations about Avatar 2, which started after I'd finished the park. So May 2017 is when I finished the work for the park. And then December 2017 is when Jim asked me to move on to Avatar: The Way of Water and read the scripts for all of the sequels.
Great, thank you, Simon. And you just mentioned the park, and subsequently Jim Cameron asked you to do Avatar 2, but was there ever any doubt in your mind regarding your potential involvement in Avatar 2?
Yeah, no, absolutely. No, that this was something that initially he asked me to do the on-screen music, and that started with the song chord, which I had to write for Neytiri. And that became the main family theme. And then we had discussions, we talked about it, but he was focusing on making the film. And gradually we sort of talked further. I'd written some other themes, whether he was enjoying, he was liking. And it sort of naturally, I think, evolved. We did some test recordings, and COVID got in the way as well. We had this thing where obviously that drastically stopped what we could do. And so I'm certain that everybody under the sun was, he was probably talking to every great composer out there, because why wouldn't you? But it felt like a natural evolution, and I feel like I've got James Horner on my one shoulder and Jim Cameron on the other, just keeping me honest.
Yes, and you did a fantastic job. And not only did you, let's say, keep James Horner's legacy alive, but you also managed to produce a great result by putting your own, let's say, stamp on the music. So your own musical voice is certainly discernible, and it's there, and it's front and center, and it's a fantastic album. And Simon, as I understand, the production took so long that you actually had to postpone the release of the physical CD. Is that a fact?
I finished recording the last cue, and it's on the album. We didn't on the score album. I didn't finish the the Kids in Peril cue until November. I recorded that November the 21st in Los Angeles. Flew back to New Zealand. We mixed it November the 23rd. It went into the film November the 24th, and we had, as we were finishing the mix of the film, and then print mastering didn't happen till December the 1st, and the premiere was December the 6th. And all of this meant that we were focusing on getting the film finished, and the soundtrack album. There is a lead time on getting to actually get physical media made. And that soundtrack, that lead time was something that we couldn't commit to saying, right, we're gonna do this, because there was nothing. Jim wouldn't want me to send out a score album that wasn't like the finished article.
I know that the first Avatar was a huge deal. The second part is a huge deal. The first one was the most expensive movie ever made at that time, and it became the highest grossing film ever up until a few years ago. And now the second one made about a billion and a half in just about a few weeks, which is a huge deal. And Simon, I'm curious, how do you deal with the anticipation that a film is basically expected to become the number one movie in the world?
I think the thing I feel most of all is relief. I feel like it's very nice that people are enjoying this. I think, because I've had the joy of actually sitting down every morning. I would sit and look up at these amazing images and see as the film evolved, because the final renders would turn up, and Christmas would come every time some new render appeared. And that's been, an astonishing thing. I think we've always had faith that it was something special, that it was a sea change in movie making, that we were working on something that was groundbreaking. I felt the same way on Avatar 1. I felt the same way on Titanic. That the audience likes it this much, I think is great. And, given that we are in a post-COVID world where people don't particularly like going to the cinema quite as much, we're being told that it'll break 2 billion sometime in the next, or maybe in 10 days time or something like that, which is quite astonishing. And I look at the streams, I cannot believe the number of people actually listening to the score, not just, Abel's, The Weeknd's fabulous song, but the score. I think I'm well over 50 million streams, which is unheard of for a score album.
That's huge. That's a huge accomplishment, and so overwhelming. And Simon, I know that composers are used to work under tight deadlines. It could be anywhere from, let's say, 4 weeks to 12 weeks to half a year. As I understand, you worked on this film for a year.
Jim requires everything to be exactly the way that he wants it to be. So that means there are rewrites, and also editing means that the picture, sometimes picture edits mean that a piece of music that worked for in the previous picture edit no longer works, because If the music went ABC and now the picture goes CAB, it may be that the music no longer fits, doesn't musically flow correctly. So I have to rewrite to allow for that. And Jim would challenge me to make a cue better. He would say, right, this is great here, but I like this, but this bit needs to be redone, and so on. And that's just part of the process. It's just that when you have 3 hours of finished score to deliver, and that means you end up writing 5 hours of finished score to get to those 3 hours.
It's a humongous task, and writing 5 hours of music and also ending up having 3 hours of music in a film is gigantic. And did you feel that James Cameron was so forthright that he would kind of approve or reject the cue right away?
No, that's not how he and I work. I mean, we have a yes, there are often an immediate reaction, and that's true of every director. There's nothing different. But he sometimes, there were points where he liked me to give him the music he would put into his Avid, and he could sit there, live with it. But also, sometimes he would do things where he'd start moving my music around, cutting bits. And it was his way of showing me what he wanted. So that sometimes there would be a cue, and he'd say, yeah, this is great. Give it to me now. And I would give him the cue. And then he'd start saying, well, actually, I like this bit. I'm going to shove this bit like 2 seconds to the left. And this bit here, I like it over here. And it's not that he wants this edit to be the thing that ends up in the finished score, but it's his way of having a conversation with the composer. He's not a musician. And he is somebody who has a very great sense of how his music should flow in a film. And so his way was to cut it and to show me this is what I would like. And that worked great for us, and because it gives me a visual feedback about, or that auditory feedback about what I want, what he wants me to do. And sometimes I have cues that were perfect the first time and never changed. So, but they would have had to go through my own process. An example would be Paya Khan. When we first meet Paya Khan, I wrote that 11 times before I showed it to Jim. And then he saw it and it never changed. It was exactly as he just went, I love this, and that's not changing. The kids jumping into the water, that first point when we suddenly look around, I did 6 versions of that, I think, before I showed it to Jim. And then he heard it and he went, I love this. This is exactly how it should be. And it never changed. So sometimes the first pass just gets nailed and you go, well, this is great. Sometimes like Darkness to Light, where their family is swimming from the bottom up to the surface, that involved 3 rewrites to get to the initial, and then 2 other rewrites to get to the point where we both felt it absolutely nailed emotionally what he wanted to say. Because there's large chunks of this film that are spent underwater. That means no dialogue. And if there's no dialogue, the music has to act as a narrator. The music has to tell you part of the story.
You are so right. If there is no dialogue, if there are only sound effects or very little sound effects, and the music basically serves as the narration, that's dream come true, basically.
Oh, I think that's true. I mean, to be honest, working on a Jim Cameron film is always a dream come true for any composer. But yes, then the challenge is, do I get that emotional connection? Because the film is telling me what to do. All I ever have to do is sit there and watch the film and allow the film to tell me what music to write. And there's a point where I feel like I have reflected the feeling of the film correctly in my music. And then that point, I then show it to Jim, and then Jim gives me the feedback and gets me to do, to say, right, this is, no, change this and change, and so on. And that's part of the process. And what is fabulous is that I only have him, and, I have myself first and then him to please. I don't have to please anybody else. There are John Landau, who provides the flow and allows everybody to work, and is a great support to all of us. But that's John doesn't interfere on the creative side. That's entirely Jim. There are many other films where you work on where you have many different voices attempting to come into the creative process. And my experience has been often that is less successful because the fewer voices you have, the better the outcome.
Yes. And I think James Cameron is in the position to really dictate the pace and to make the decisions because he has been so successful. You know, everything that he touched basically turned into gold, more or less. I mean, Titanic, Avatar, and other pictures that were tremendously successful.
I've done now 4 projects with, I've done Titanic, Avatar, The Park, and this. And I've got 3 more to do. It's like there is an Avatar family as well. There is this crew that we all work together, that we all have this ability to collaborate, and it means that sometimes the collaborations are very unusual. There is no world where I and the costume designer and the production designer and the prop master would work together in a thing we call Culture Club, where we're discussing how culturally we want to make sure there's coherence between the stuff that I was doing and the stuff that comes in the costume and the stuff that is production design, the stuff that is the props. And that coherence is part of the Avatar process, is part of Jim's world, which is that we don't just make rubbish up. We don't just say, I'm going to make this particular thing. I designed the musical instruments for the Na'vi, and those musical instruments were something based on the physiology of the Na'vi, that they are 3 meters tall, that they have 3 fingers generally, and so on, and the fingers are quite long. So I designed instruments based on the physiology of them. I drew these instruments, and then Dylan Cole, the lead production designer, then made a beautiful version that they then designed in the computer, at which point the prop master printed them in 3D. Then we have 3D real instruments from Pandora that can be played, and I have played them, and I use samples from them in this film. But we'll actually see them, I think, in 3, I hope. But that's an example of something that is the level of detail that we require on Avatar.
I know that James Cameron has always been described as very detail specific and challenging to work for. What do you think is the biggest takeaway for you personally on this picture?
The biggest takeaway is we have a thing he calls the shit art boundary. Everything up to 99% is shit and 100% is art. And I had to break through that boundary as far as he was concerned. And he might vary. He might say it's a 9.9 rather than 10. Sometimes the boundary, the percentages would change on the boundary. But the idea was the same, that you never give up until you break that boundary. And you keep working until thinks at the point where I am now, think this is great and this is comfortable. And he's great in that he will allow me to make mistakes. He's allowing me to try things out. He's saying, and he'll be blunt with me and say, "Now I hate that." And that's fine because it makes life very simple. You hate that? Right. Well, we're not doing that, are we? We'll go and do this instead. So there is this constant challenge that the entire crew, the 3,800 people who worked on Avatar, there is this challenge that we all have to try and obviously break new boundaries, always make things as good as we can. I worked with some people in Hungary who created these specialist reverbs for me with that were samples of how sound travels underwater using a thing called the Inspirator reverb. And they created certain things for me and for Chris Boyes that allowed us to actually give us to give us the ability to place a sound as if it was underwater. And those are the sort of levels of detail that we go to on Avatar.
Right. And I think it's important to have honesty in a collaboration and to really trust somebody and to give them a certain amount of leeway, as opposed to, saying, well, I didn't like this cue and that cue, so you're fired, which makes no sense at all, because you have to fiddle with, certain aspects of the filmmaking business. It's not a one man operation. It's not a, let's say, here we are, we can make this film in 5 days. So it takes time, and it takes time to evolve. And I think what you've just described is essential.
I think so too. I mean, I think um, I'm signed for all of the sequels until my job on a daily basis is to stay not fired. And because Jim feels the same way about himself. He said, look, we're all there. In his case, the public may fire him. Then the public may say, well, look, imagine we had a situation where we released this film and the public says, yeah, okay, we don't like it. He has a boss as well, and the boss is the worldwide audience. Um, and but we're always striving to do the best. There is a thing. Jim doesn't allow something to happen until he's happy and until he's finished. And I may have had a year, but he used up every second of that just because because of the process. And I'm sure that the same thing will happen on Avatar 3, because this has been the same on Avatar 2, Avatar 1, at Titanic. They were all up to the wire. They all just about finished, and I'm looking forward to it because it's an astonishing thing to see. And Avatar 3 is a phenomenal film, absolutely phenomenal. There is a rough cut that exists that I love. There's still work to be done, but there's some great stuff.
I'm looking forward to it. Have you already developed some musical ideas for part three?
No, it's. I mean, I don't actually start scoring that for a year, but yes, I've already written a whole load of on-screen music. There are things on screen that we did in 2018 and 19, because we shot 2 and 3 together. So there's plenty of. I've already come up with some things. I've written some music for specific scenes that we've already sort of roughed up. And there's a whole new set of challenges. There are new characters. There's a whole load of new stuff that's going to require the same attention to detail that we had on A2.
Fantastic. And the second part is huge, and the digital album has been out for a couple of weeks now, and there's 100 minutes of music on it. And there's also a shorter version which contains about, I think, 75 minutes of music.
The
Yeah,
parallels on what you could get on a CD, yeah.
yeah, including the song by The Weeknd. Did you also have a hand in the song?
I co-wrote the song and I co-produced the song with the Swedish House Mafia. So Jim and I talked about if there was going to be a song in the end, and I wrote down one name. I wrote down The Weeknd. He was the only person that was the person I wanted to work with, and Abel was touring, so his ability to he saw the film, and then he wasn't able to actually get into working on the track until September. He and Swedish House Mafia started working on a track. They sent it to me, and then I brought Pandora into the song. They sent me all the rough tracks. I started adding like Navi voices, drums. I changed the chord structure to reflect some of the things like Darkness to Light. You'll hear a very similar chord structure in the track, and the way that I'm using ba-da-da-da, that vocal thing at the beginning, and so on. There were things to bring that point so that we had the joint, because Jim and I both wanted an idea that the song would flow naturally out of the score and out of the film, that it didn't feel like it was just bashed on, a pop song was bashed on. You had to keep that at the atmosphere of Avatar alive. And I think he did a phenomenal job.
Simon, I'm curious, in terms of matching the score to the visuals in terms of getting everything right, what do you think was the most impressive scene or the most difficult scene for you to score? I know it's probably a hard question to answer because the film is so long and there are so many impressive scenes, but what do you think?
In terms of the one that the challenge probably was biggest would be on a technical basis, I would say probably the knife fight between Quaritch and Jake, that whole thing there, because it's a hand-to-hand combat, but I also have huge amounts of rushing water. I've got burning oil. I've got a ship that is groaning and clanking. There's metal going on and voices. And it's an epic cue. I have everything, I've literally, it's the end of close to an hour of action. And I've got to this point where I have built all the way through to the final bit underwater, which is where the action finally stops. And that section there, I think, was the most difficult because to challenge of working against the sound design is sometimes half of the problem with music is that rushing water and machine guns and helicopters are all terrible because they destroy music. I had to have all three often at the same time. That was the biggest challenge. Or emotionally, the biggest challenge, I think, was the darkness to light cue, was that swim out, that point where we go from utter desolation to hope and to that resolution and the emotional connection that I had to do over 4 or 5 minutes. And I wrote that 3 times. I wrote it initially. Jim looked at it and said, yeah, this is great. And then 2 weeks later, he came back to me and said, nah, you can do better. And then I wrote it again. And then he said, no, we need to get everybody crying the whole way through this cue. And the last time I wrote it, I played it to him and he started crying within 5 seconds. And I kept him all the way to the surfacing. And at that point I knew, and he said, I said, I think I've done it, haven't I? And he said, yeah, maybe you have. And that was probably the biggest challenge emotionally because it's such an important scene. And there is pretty well no dialogue for 4 or 5 minutes. And initially I probably overscored it. I wrote it as a bigger thematic thing, and then gradually it became much more heart-based. And I started with a solo cello against this counterpoint against Kiri's theme, and the solo cello playing the family theme, and those two working against each other. That's the one I emotionally feel I'm most proud of.
Great. Thank you, Simon, for elaborating on that. And is there anything else you would like to add before we wrap up our great conversation?
Oh, yeah. Well, I'll give you one thing, which is there are Easter eggs in the score that often will not pay off until 5. If I am not fired, there are things in score for 2 that will make sense in 5.
And I'm looking forward to chatting again down the road. I'm sure there are so many more things to talk about, given the fact that you have been so successful also in the pop music world and you have, a tremendous output. So I'm looking forward to chatting again. And I had a great time talking to you today, and I hope you enjoyed the conversation as well.
Very much indeed. It is great to be here, Michael, and I look forward to repeating this conversation in times to come.